Welcome to a video about setting the daily intake, recommended dietary intake, and estimated safe and adequate daily dietary intake percentages on your label in a Foodworks online nutrition labeling workspace. In this video, I will define these terms and show you how to display the percentages on your labels. Let's get started. The daily intake states the percentage that a single serving of a food or beverage provides of the recommended daily intake of the mandatory Nutrition Information Panel nutrients, including energy, protein, fat, saturated fat, carbohydrate, sugars, and sodium, as well as dietary fiber, which is not a mandatory nutrient. This information is voluntary and is provided to help consumers understand the nutritional content of the product. For more information, see Standard 1.2.8 of the Food Standards Code. The recommended dietary intake and estimated safe and adequate daily dietary intake percentages applies to vitamins and minerals and must be provided if a nutrition claim is made about a vitamin or mineral that has a recommended dietary intake or estimated safe and adequate daily dietary intake value. For more information, see Standard 1.2.8 and Schedule 1 of the Food Standards Code. To display any of these percentages for nutrients on your labels, you first need to enable the nutrients in your workspace settings and ensure a value exists in the Recipes Overrides tab. In my workspace, I have a recipe that includes values for all of the mandatory nutrients and some non-mandatory nutrients with recommended dietary intake or estimated safe and adequate daily dietary intake values. On the screen, you can see the nutrients with a daily intake value, which is available for each mandatory label nutrient as well as dietary fiber. This table also shows the nutrients that have either recommended dietary intake or estimated safe and adequate daily dietary intake values. Note that when displaying percent daily intake values, you are required to show the percent daily intake values for every mandatory declared nutrient. In contrast, when displaying percent recommended dietary intake and estimated safe and adequate daily dietary intake values, you can choose to share some or all of the relevant nutrient values. Now that you understand what these terms mean and what is required when you want to show them on your label, let's move on to how to actually display these percentages on your labels in Foodworks Online. Firstly, to display the percent daily intake column for mandatory nutrients on a label, in your Open Recipe, navigate to the Labeling tab, then click the NIP sub-tab and toggle on the Show Percent Daily Intake column. You can now see that my label has an additional column to display the contribution of a single serve of this recipe to the recommended daily intake of energy, protein, fat, saturated fat, carbohydrates, sugars, dietary fiber, and sodium. To display the recommended dietary intake and estimated safe and adequate daily dietary intake values for non-mandatory nutrients on a label, on the recipe's NIP sub-tab, tick the relevant non-mandatory nutrients in the NIP nutrients container to display them as an option in the Show Recommended Dietary Intake and Estimated Safe and Adequate Daily Dietary Intake container. Then, in the Show Recommended Dietary Intake and Estimated Safe and Adequate Daily Dietary Intake container, select the relevant nutrients you wish to display on the label by individually selecting them, which I will do now. You can now see that these nutrients include the relevant percent recommended dietary intake and estimated safe and adequate daily dietary intake values. Note that when the daily intake column is enabled, the recommended dietary intake and estimated safe and adequate daily dietary intake values appear in this column. If the daily intake column is not enabled, the recommended dietary intake and estimated safe and adequate daily dietary intake values will appear in the average quantity per serving column like this. This brings us to the end of the video about setting the percent daily intake, recommended dietary intake, and estimated safe and adequate daily dietary intake on a food label. To access more video resources, please click the thumbnail on this screen. Thank you for watching.